Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
And it's a great pleasure now to introduce Dr Alasdair Coles, who is an academic neurologist in Cambridge. His primary research interest is in the immunology and treatment of multiple sclerosis. And indeed, it was a little while ago that I spotted Alasdair on the local news having made some great breakthrough with regard to this disease, I think. So, very, very important work he's doing there. And he has been medical advisor to the Multiple Sclerosis Society in the UK and advising pharmaceutical companies. He's been a scientific advisor and contributor to a film, a documentary about the effects of multiple sclerosis on the graphic artist Johnny Hinkleton, which has won awards. He's also a priest in the Church of England, ordained priest in 2009 and working part-time as curate in a church in Cambridge. And we're going to hear now about his amateur research interest, the neurological basis for religious experience, which we hope might become slightly more professional perhaps with some, maybe some new funding. But it's a great pleasure to introduce Alasdair to us.
Thanks very much. So, news items like this are not infrequent. And this was the #1 hit on the BBC Science website for that year. It was the prime news story. There seems to be something special about images of the brain during religious or spiritual experiences that excites people's imagination. And what I want to leave you with, I hope, is a sense of gentle cynicism about some of these studies and excitement about what the future might hold. And I'll give you examples of both of those. So the first point I want to make is this. This is a famous picture of St. Francis hearing God speaking to him from the crucifix at San Damiano Church, telling him to rebuild the church, and you all know that story. And I wonder what you think is interesting about that episode. And whether you think the most interesting thing might be, well, if I told you that in the brain of St. Francis at that time, Rodman Area 3 was active. Would that be the most interesting thing you could say about that? And I think one of the important questions is when people tell you something like that, is you say, so what? So what? What is the significance of that? Because for me, what's much more interesting is what then happened, and the impact that had on his life, and what he went to do with the church. Those are the important issues of that event, aren't they? And I think we do have to put the neuroscience of religious experience back in its box to some extent. This is, of course, of vast interest to people like me who, if you like, are the sort of computer nerds of brain mechanism. And for me that is interesting that Rodman Area 3 is active, but only because it's set within a context of multiple resonances which lead me to make some conclusions. So I'll try and bring that out. But the important question is always, so what? Now, everyday brain scanning in a hospital near you has as its apotheosis the MRI scan, which gives you beautiful pictures of the structure of the brain. And that's what we use clinically. It's fantastically helpful. It is completely useless when it comes to studies of experience because, at least in the context of religious experience, there has been no study that's demonstrated any structural difference between the brains of people who are religious and those who are not. But so what? What else would you expect? So what we're talking about are images of brain function, and I'm going to show you and talk to you a little bit about some of the different technologies here, because I think that's important. But the first thing that you will spot is that, of course, these are much cruder images. And what we're trying to conclude from an image like this is what's actually going on in the brain, what is active, which parts of the brain are working more than others when we do that scan. And again, the question is, so what? And the usual answer to that in the academic literature is, I have seen this before in another context. And I'm going to link the picture that's derived from the person having one experience with the experiences which generate a similar picture. And if that sounds a bit convoluted, that hopefully will become clearer. Okay, so let's deal with something that's been very widely studied. If we look at the brain, people are meditating or praying, what do we see? And here's a study by some famous researchers in this area using a SPECT scan. And this is a scan that's done in this way. You take a person and you put them in whatever environment they want to have their experience. In the context of this study, the environment was a room with lots of cushions and scented candles, which a trained Buddhist meditator, I'm quoting, found most convenient for meditating. When he reached his deepest level of meditation, he pulled a rope, which went round the side, went through the door to the researchers at the other end, who felt the tweak, and they came rushing in and injected him with a radioactive isotope. So you then take this person, deeply meditating, and you put them in the scanner. The scanner's not particularly unpleasant or whatever. And what the point about this, the clever thing is that you're not scanning in real time. You're scanning exactly what was going on when that tracer was injected. And you'll see why that's important. And you get, so you get these images. So these are two different levels of the brain when this person is not thinking about anything, and this is two different levels of the brain when they're meditating. And there's a difference, carefully and helpfully pointed out by this arrow, which shows you that, in this case, blood flow during the meditative state is reduced in this area compared to that. Okay. So you conclude from that that this part of the brain is less active in the meditative state from baseline. And I think that's undeniable. But the question is, so what? So what does that tell us? Now, the argument that these investigators came up with is, well, I know that that part of the brain has something to do with integration of different sensory modalities, integration of touch, vision, hearing, and taste. Therefore, all of those sensory modalities are reduced during meditation, and so we see here the mechanism that underlies the de-afferentation of meditation, that sense that you are disconnecting yourself from your environment. Now I say to that, so what? Because in a sense you knew that that is part of the meditation experience. In fact, furthermore, you're using that knowledge to interpret backwards what the brain scan shown you. So I don't think this advances us at all. Now what these people have gone on to do is to say, well, I say more than that. This person is experiencing God in some sense in this state. There is a real demonstrable change in the brain during this experience. Therefore, God is real. That's the logic. Okay? That is the basis of Newberg and de Quilly's argument, that we can prove the existence of God by proving that the brain, whilst experiencing God, has real measurable changes within it. Exactly the same sort of observations are used in exactly the opposite way. So someone like Michael Persinger will look at this, has looked at this and said, aha, this person is experiencing God whilst their brain is active. Therefore, the experience of God is nothing but a fantasy produced by activity in parts of the brain. What I want to do is say neither of those positions are acceptable. This isn't a test of whether God is real or not. You cannot, by imaging the brain, make any conclusions about whether God exists or not. All you can do is talk about the mechanisms of the experience that that person is having. And in my view, this study really doesn't take us much further. So in answer to the so what question, I would say not a lot. The other point to make about this study is that this got onto the front page of the Sunday Times. And I think that's one of the worries about this sort of research, because it is intuitively exciting, it's visually gripping, and it seems to be telling you something important. And I think one of the reasons why these images are so popular in the media, and I'd be interested if we can discuss this perhaps later on, is not so much what it tells you about this, but what it tells you about the basic assumptions out there, as it were, amongst the lay public of how the brain is involved in the religious experience. Because many people I meet are very, very surprised that you can measure anything in the brain during any religious activity, because religion is spiritual and spiritual has nothing to do with the brain. Sort of. And I think that dualism that's latent amongst some people is excited and threatened or inflamed by these sort of pictures, and that's why they have so much traction. Okay. I'm going to leave that to one side. We'll come back to that. Okay. So, another experience that people have very, very commonly, and I'll explain why, is the out-of-body experience. And there will be someone here who's had this experience, and I'll explain why. What it is this is, the person having it is person B. And there are two forms. They can either think that they're being duplicated and another version of them is high up in the room looking back down on themselves or on other people, or that they have just become raised, leaving that site empty and shuttling about in free air. Now mostly you will associate this with near-death experience. The reason why I'm showing you this is because this is someone with migraine. And the commonest cause of this experience is migraine. And there will be someone with migraine here. And if you take time with people who have migraine in your congregations, you will find them describing the most unusual things. Now, what we can do is take someone who gets lots of migraines and put them in an MRI scanner. Now, notice the difference here. Now, this is seriously unpleasant being in here. This is very claustrophobic. You have about a ton of metal a few inches above your head, and you have a noise like this going on all the time. I don't know if anyone's had an MRI scan or been near a scanner. It's loud. It's very unpleasant. You can see nothing unless you can wear a funny little mirror which looks down at your feet down here, and no one else is in this room. There's a disembodied voice which talks to you. It's not a pleasant experience, and in this context you have to undergo the experiment. In this case, the experiment is simply having a migraine. So you just wait until someone has a migraine. And when they're having this out-of-body experience, you find very systematically, predictably, an area of the brain lighting up that's in the temporal lobes. Now, in answer to your question, so what? The answer is, this resonates with literally hundreds of years of observation on people with temporal lobe epilepsy, most notably Dostoevsky, who describes the positive spiritual experience of having epilepsy originating from the temporal lobe. And if in your congregations, for instance, you have people with temporal lobe epilepsy, and you take the time to explore this if you're willing to accept the consequences, they may well describe to you very strange, sometimes very pleasurable spiritual experiences. And I think that's a real challenge in terms of the pastoral care of these people. Now here's an interesting question. Have you ever considered whether having a faith will reduce your experience of pain? Is that a theologically sound proposition? Now, it never occurred to me to test this, but in a very widely reported study just a few years ago, this question was addressed. And it's addressed by a very good research group who I know well, who are actually a pain research group, and they, as it were, took a kind of sideswipe at the pain research field and asked this question. If you're a Catholic and you're shown a picture of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and you're then prodded with a cattle prod, do you experience less pain than if you're a non-Catholic who's seen the Blessed Virgin Mary, or you're a Catholic and you've seen a lady of similar aesthetics, but who isn't the Blessed Virgin Mary? Now, is that really something that's very interesting? Does that have a lot of theology behind it? Well, I don't know. So the way this goes is, you're in a scanner, okay? Remember, you're in a scanner, you've got this ton of metal on top, you've got the noise like this, okay? And then through the mirror, you're shown for 30 seconds the Blessed Virgin Mary or someone else, and then you're given a painful stimulus, cattle prod, for 12 seconds, and then you have 9 seconds in which to say how painful this was on the scale with your foot, and then another 9 seconds to say how moved you were by this experience, and then 12 seconds of rest, and then you go back again, and it's repeated, and it's repeated about 20 times. Okay? That's the experiment. You're in that scanner for about an hour. Okay? And you're either an atheist or you're Catholic from Oxford, 12 in each, and that's it. So what were the results? Well, the first thing is these are the results that have got nothing to do with being in the scanner. So these are non-Catholics, atheists, these are Catholics. This is how painful it was. And you can see that in the religious condition, that is, looking at the Blessed Virgin Mary, does seem to reduce the intensity of pain, the experience of pain. If you're an atheist, you find none of this terribly moving. If you're a Catholic, you find seeing the Blessed Virgin Mary really very vivid. Now, I think those are interesting results. We can talk about what that all means. But let me just remind you, that's got nothing to do with the brain scan. Okay? You could have done that without doing the brain scan. So here's the brain scan picture. So this is what we got from the brain scan. Now here's my main point on methodology, which is something I want to get across. So these are not the scans of an individual brain. When you look at them, that's what you think they are, don't you? You look at that and you think that's one person and that's a bright spot and that's their brain acting. That is not what these are. This is very deceptive. These are statistical maps of the average of 20 trials in 12 patients, not patients, subjects, averaged out. And you can set the statistical significance of your test high or low. So if you will accept a low p-value, low statistical significance, all of that brain will light up because all of the brain is active to some extent. If you set the statistical significance very high, you'll see nothing. So where you place the cursor is rather important. And what the test is, I mean, let me just take an example. This bit of brain is active in Catholics as opposed to atheists when they're looking at the Blessed Virgin Mary. This bit of brain is active amongst atheists and not Catholics when they're looking at the non-Blessed Virgin Mary picture. So these are subtracted averages. And the question is, so what? What does this actually tell us about this experience? And the only conclusion that the researchers came to, which I think is the right scientific conclusion, is that this is complex. And multiple parts of the brain are involved. Okay. So I'm now going to move on to some things which I think are really very provocative and interesting. So if you were to be asked by your congregations, is disbelief the opposite of belief? If I say to you, by disbelief, what I mean is this: I believe this is not an elephant. There's a positive assertion that this is not something. Is that the same as saying, I believe this to be a cupboard? Okay? Now that's an interesting question, isn't it? Believing something to be true, believing something not to be true. And here's some examples. Do you think that 2 plus 6 plus 8 equals 16? Well, I believe that to be true. 62 can be evenly divided by 9. Well, I believe that is not true. And I guess most of you would agree. And then you read this statement, 1.257 equals 326.8.515. And you sort of think, what is that? And for a moment you're uncertain. In the realm of ethics, it's bad to take pleasure at another's suffering. Most people would agree. Children should have no rights until they can vote. Most people will say, I do not believe that. And then you have this slightly equivocal one. It's better to lie to a child than to an adult. We can have a conversation about that, couldn't we? In the religious domain, a personal God exists just as the Bible describes. Now there are people who say, I believe that to be true. There are people who say, I believe that not to be true. And in a sense, that doesn't matter, just for a moment. There is probably no actual creator God. So this is a statement of disbelief. And then Jesus spoke 2,467 words in the New Testament. Well, most of us, possibly not the Baptists, but most of us would have some uncertainty about that. You'd know so, wouldn't you?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, exactly. You've counted them. So these are realms of questions which span those shades of certainty that this is true, certainty that this is untrue, and somewhere in between. Okay. Now, the question then becomes, if you look at the brains of people struggling with these issues, would they deal with them differently? Is it different to say that 2 plus 6 plus 8 equals 16 is true, to a personal God exists just as the Bible describes? Are those different statements of belief, or are they not? Is saying 2 plus 6 plus 8 equals 16 the same thing as saying 62 cannot be evenly divided by 9? Is that the same sort of thing? Okay. Right. So, these are maps, remember? And this is the map of taking the brain pathways that are active when someone says they believe something to be true, away from the brain pathways that are active when people say, I believe something not to be true. Across all those domains, from maths to ethics. Now my prejudice would be to say that the pathways that mediate something to be true are exactly the same as the pathways that mediate something not to be true. They'll be equivalent. And so if you subtract one from another, you would get nothing. But here actually, you get a definite signal in the left frontal lobe. So this area of the brain, it seems, is specifically mediating the experience of saying, I believe something to be true. And it is not active when we say we believe something not to be true. Now, very interestingly, I think, if you just look at the mathematics questions, which are verifiable, you get the same pathways active. And if you look at the ethical questions, which are not verifiable, which are matters of debate, you get exactly the same pathways active. In other words, when I declare that I know that Allah will reward me if I commit jihad, I believe that to be true. That is mediated in the same brain pathways as when I say 2 plus 6 plus 8 equals 16. There is no difference in my mind or in my brain. Now, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? That we do not modulate within the brain for verifiability. Furthermore, when we do the opposite, we say what brain pathways are involved when we say something is not true compared to when we say something is true. And here you get a completely different picture, different parts of the brain involved. So, different mechanisms, just as we said. And now I do the thing which you have to take on trust. I say, I've seen these pictures before. I've seen them before, and I'll tell you that this activation in the insula is exactly the same activation you would get if you taste something bitter or sour, as a human or as an animal. So a very fundamental part of our evolution, if you'll accept that, if you don't mind me using this term, is a pathway that rapidly detects if we're eating something sour and then vomits it out. And you can see the selective advantage of that. And in the brain, this is the picture you would get. Whereas, in the brain, this is exactly the sort of part of the brain that's active when we feel pleasure and joy. And so, the researchers conclude that a positive belief is rewarded by a sense of joy, or is mediated by the same processes that mediate joy, and a positive disbelief, saying that something is untrue, is equivalent to saying something disgusts us. Now, isn't that interesting? As a speculative conclusion. Now, I'll make a simple point, is that this, to be, what I've just described is a speculation. The right experiment would, of course, be to compare saying you believe something not to be true with drinking acid in the MRI scan. If you're really going to push this to extreme, you do actually have to test it, and they haven't tested it. And that should be the next step. Okay. So, here's another question. You'll have to forgive me if you don't accept evolution, but let's allow that we evolved from lower animals and ask the question, does our brain, in its religious experience, use an entirely novel part of the brain that is only involved in humans, or does it evolve up through the higher mammals, or that's there in all animals or plants? In other words, the toolkit that we use to experience God, just how far down the evolutionary pathway does it go? And of course, the answer to this has really profound implications. The reason for raising this is because there are parts of what it is to be human that have evolved just within humans, and for which there is a separate brain mechanism. And the clear example of that is language. So that there are two parts of the brain, well, multiple parts, but these two main parts, which only exist in humans, only exist in the human brain, which subserve human language, which is unique to us. So, using religion as an example, do we have similar parts of the brain that mediate religion that is just human? Or has something else happened? Okay. So this is a study which looks at 26 people who have a range of religious beliefs and none. And to understand the study, you have to understand a bit of a preamble where the investigators have said and given evidence for the statement that all of religious belief, practice, and experience can be crudely summarized within 3 different domains. The domain that how closely you perceive God is involved in your life, ranging from God is intimately involved with every moment of my life and I feel him or her close by me, through to God either doesn't exist or is completely indifferent. The second dimension is God's perceived emotion towards me. At one end, God is angry with me, wants to punish me, wants to give me sickness and illness and so on, through to God loves me and protects me and cares for me. And then the third dimension, which is where we get our religious knowledge from, either taught by church leaders, doctrine, or experience. And the basis of this study, which we could argue with, but it's not a very fruitful argument, is that every person can be placed on this spectrum in 3 dimensions, as it were. Okay, so then what you do is you scan these subjects in a variety of different conditions, getting them to answer questions, do tasks, and place themselves on these different domains. And then you do highly complex statistics to reduce everything down to what parts of the brain are involved in any aspect on this dimension. Okay. So these are parts of the brain that are involved in saying either that God's very close to me or God's indifferent and doesn't exist. It doesn't matter where on that dimension they are, but this is the pathway for this dimension. These are the brain pathways or the brain areas that will map you on the dimension of how emotional God is towards you, or how you perceive that, whether you feel God loves you or hates you. And here are those parts of the brain that are involved in learning your religion from doctrine, or from leaders, or from spiritual experiences. So the first thing to say is that they are all different. The brain has different pathways for mediating these different dimensions, which just tells us that this is complicated. But, and here you have to trust me, the investigators say, I've seen these pictures before. And I agree with this. I agree with this. These are exactly the sort of pictures that you would get if you took any human, a normal healthy human, and asked them how other people think of them. These are tests of the technical term is theory of mind. So, I haven't met you, sir, but one of my skills as a human is, and only humans have this to a very fine degree, is I will build up some evidence of what you think about me. If you were asleep, that would be one part of evidence. I build up this picture of whether you like me, whether you care about me, whether you think I'm interesting or not. And that's what we do, isn't it? That is part of what being a human is and how we integrate with people. And more than that, in higher order theories of mind, I will try to work out what you think I think of you. Okay? And pastorally, that's what we do, isn't it? In a pastoral context, these are the complex interactions that we got. This is theory of mind. And this is exactly the brain pathways that we use when we do those tasks. In other words, when you and I think of God, or at least when these subjects were thinking of God, and whether God was involved in our lives, we were using exactly the same brain pathways as we're involved in whether we think our wife cares about us, whether we think our teacher cares about us, or our congregation. No different at the level of brain pathways. Similarly, experiencing other people, and similarly learning about anything. This could be the pathways that involved in learning about football. So there is no privatized religious domain in the brain. In our evolution, we have adopted the mechanisms involved in more mundane, everyday experiences. So religion is not like language. It is not a privatized, unique human fact. Now this raises the issue, which is where the neuroscience goes back to the theologians and say, what do you make of this? Okay? So this raises the possibility that higher order primates, who possess the faculty for first and second order theory of mind, could experience God. Okay? Or higher mammals. So this is where this dialogue is important, because that may or may not have been an issue for you, but when you read this experiment, I hand it back to you and say, now this is an issue, you theologians, you have to grapple with the possibility that higher animals who have the faculty for theory of mind can experience God. And it raises another issue. What about those humans who do not have the capacity for theory of mind? Best example of those are autistic people, people with autism, particularly people with higher order autism who are functioning in your communities, in your congregations. Now they do not possess the capacity for theory of mind, not complex. And you will know this, won't you? In your interactions with people with high level autism, they're not thinking, what are you thinking of me? They're not thinking that at all. They cannot do that task. So can they experience God in the way that you do? Or should we, in the church, change the way we present God, the way we think of God, the way we articulate God, in a way that people who lack theory of mind can appreciate? I don't have answers to these questions, but I'm trying to illustrate the tension, the useful creative tension that can exist when we get together and discuss things like this. Okay. This doesn't say a whole lot more new, but I thought you might find this interesting. This is looking at prayer, and this is a group of, I think they're Dutch, Danish. So they've got some hardcore Danish, what they describe as fundamental Christians, whatever that is, and they made them pray in the scan, and they made them recite the Lord's Prayer. They made them pray extempore. They made them say a nursery rhyme, and they made them wish something for Christmas from Santa Claus. And they then got together the scans, and this is actually a more honest depiction of what these scans are like, because you can see this is a highly artificial construct. This is a statistical map, and that's actually a more honest depiction of what really arises. And they examine the left frontal lobe, which is the part we've previously talked at, and they look at the brain activation. And what they try and make the argument for, and I think is reasonably true, is that the parts of the brain that are active during personal praying are those that are used during social interactions. I'm talking between you and I. That's active when we have interesting human interrelations. Whereas the Lord's Prayer gets a little bit of a hit there, but is less relational, if you like. Whereas reciting a nursery rhyme or making wishes to Santa Claus when you don't believe in Santa Claus is neither here nor there. So this speaks again to the social aspect of our personal relationship with God and our prayer. Okay. stop at 5?
Yeah, so about 5, yeah.
Okay, I'm actually
And then
going
we
to...
have questions.
Yeah, I'm going to skip back. If you get vertigo, don't watch this. Because I've got a little bit of time to get back to something that I missed out on. I promise you I'll finish on time. Problem. Okay. Now, one of the things that you don't see on the front of magazines are the sort of images I'm about to show you, and the reason why is they're not that attractive. But I think this is a very interesting experiment, and this is asking not about pathways in the brain, but about chemicals within the brain. And our brains work by having structural pathways that serve distinct functions, but also having chemical distinctness. So within a pathway you can have different neurotransmitters and they will subserve different functions. So it's very reasonable to ask the question, what are the chemicals involved in religious belief? The particular chemical that was looked at here was 5-HT, or serotonin, which is the chemical that's believed to be reduced in depression. And most of your middle-aged female congregation, or more than half, will be taking drugs that interact on this pathway. So this is why this is potentially. So here you have a rather suave-looking neurologist who, I don't actually know who this is, but he must have gone to Oxford or Cambridge. I somehow and he's explaining what you do in these scans. So here what you do, this is a PET scan, is you take a long needle, you inject into an artery in the wrist, which is not a pleasant experience if you have that. It's quite distinct from having drug taken. And you inject a radioactive tracer, and then you have something like 20 or 30 seconds while that radioactive tracer goes around, and you have to, as it were, do something in that time, and then the tracer is recorded in this very open scanner. So it's not a problem with discomfort within the scanner, but there's a serious problem with this needle in your wrist. But anyway. And what you can measure is the amount of binding of the chemical you just put in to any part of the brain. You can go down on any part of the brain, and the names in a sense don't matter, and you can measure that in this person, the chemical you've put in binds very highly, very avidly, very strongly in that part of the brain, whereas in that person it doesn't bind very much at all. And what this tells us about is the receptor binding capacity in these different parts of the brain. So this person, for whatever reason, has receptors that bind this chemical avidly, and this person does not. So the question is there any difference between these people and what they experience in religious life that can be explained by different receptor binding in different parts of the brain? This is the kind of conclusion. They look at a lot of different parts of the religious life, and they come up with two different things. So spiritual acceptance score is a score that says, I accept that there is a non-material world, a spiritual world, that there's a God up here, or right down here, that all the world is matter, there is nothing but matter. Here, a high score on self-transcendence is that I have moments when I feel I'm in contact with an ethereal world, an oceanic feeling, a numinous world, something other, through to there's no such thing, it's just indigestion. Okay. And what you can see, and the details really don't matter, I think, to get the main point, is that there does seem to be a relationship. In other words, the receptor binding on the 5-HT system in your brain cell does mediate to some extent how you feel on these different scores. Now this is grist to the mill of the hard materialist, okay? Because one way of interpreting this would be to say, you, sir, just happen to have been born with high 5-HT receptor binding in your raphe nucleus. And there's nothing to your spiritual life that cannot be explained like that. You were either lucky or unlucky with how the 5-HT receptor that you were born. Or, you, sir, have been taking a drug that's active on your 5-HT system for the last decade, and many, many people do, and that's entirely responsible for your spiritual experience. That would be the hard reductionist interpretation of this, and I hope that will encourage some discussion. Okay, right, back to my... Oh, no. I'm going to end a bit early, but one of the things that slightly frustrates me about talking about brain imaging is because in the end, all you ever do is show an association of two things. And as I was just intimating, you don't really show the causal relationship. All you can do is show maps and say, I've seen this before, it's a bit like this. Or if you do this, then you get this in the brain bit. The causal relationship is difficult to disentangle. And what I wanted to show you is how you might go about delineating a causal relationship. And so here's a question. Can you modify the brain so that it becomes more or less moral? Could you make your congregation believe by doing this or that thing to them? And so this is a newly published paper using the technique of transcranial magnetic stimulation. So we're outside of imaging now. And what this does is you take an electric paddle, like that, and you take it across the brain, if you don't mind, sir, and you apply a magnetic field, which you won't feel, but it alters the electrical behaviour of a part of the brain just underlying this paddle. So if I did it, for instance, over my left motor cortex, then transiently the right side of my body would go paralysed, as known as stroke. As soon as I relieve the magnetic field, I recover function. So this is a fantastically helpful way of intruding in the brain and seeing what happens. Now, what I've told you is that there is a suggestion that our acceptance of beliefs and disbelief, acceptance of belief is related to the sense of pleasure, of joy, and as part of that, and I haven't shown you evidence for this, there's the suggestion that our sense of what is morally right is mediated by the same brain mechanisms that mediate pleasure and joy. So the question is, can I interfere with that? So you take a group of subjects and you destabilize part of the brain, and it doesn't matter which it is. And you then do a test. So just look at this little panel here. There are various different conditions of belief and different outcomes. And this is all to do with this mind experiment. So you're Grace. Grace and your friend are taking a tour of a chemical plant. Grace goes over the coffee machine to pour some coffee. Grace, your friend, asks for some sugar in her coffee. The white powder by the coffee is ... Because the substance is marked in a container marked toxic, Grace, you think that it is ... Grace puts the substance in her friend's coffee. Her friend drinks the coffee and ... Now you'll appreciate that if you think that the sugar is a toxin and you put it in your friend's coffee and your friend dies, that's a rather different moral situation than if you think it is sugar and it is sugar and she's fine. Okay? It's also rather different if you think it is toxic but it's not, and the friend lives. That's a different moral situation. So you, Grace, think the powder is sugar. It is actually sugar. The friend is fine, is one condition. Or, Grace, you think the powder is toxic. It is toxic. The friend dies. That's very, very bad. Or you think it's sugar, but it's toxic and your friend dies, so not your fault. If you think it's toxic, it's sugar, your friend's fine. Well, you intended to cause harm, but no harm is done. So do you see how changing just a few parameters makes a story span the kind of dimension of culpability and moral evil, if you like. So the question that you now ask is, if I go through these scenarios with subjects who are well and healthy and ask them how morally evil this is in each different condition, and then you repeat it, but this time taking out one part of the brain, what might happen? So here's the results. So in the, it doesn't matter whether you look at experiment 1 or experiment 2, we'll look at experiment 2 just for clarity. You have a range here where the person says this, what's happened is entirely acceptable, down to this is forbidden, morally evil. So this is what happens if you've got just healthy people. So we'll go through this. These are the 4 conditions. This is when I believe that the sugar is just sugar. Well, that's entirely permissible to give someone sugar, and there's a nutrient. The friend is fine. This is if I believe that the sugar is toxic. This is if I believe the sugar is toxic and the friend dies. Well, that's very, very bad. That is forbidden. That's morally evil. This is how permissible I think it is if I think the substance is sugar, but they in fact die. Well, it's a little less permissible because maybe you should have taken more care, but it's not really your fault, is what the healthy people are saying. This is a condition where you believe that what you've got is a toxin, and yet you still give it, but in fact it was sugar. Well, the healthy people say, well, that's not really any better than if the patient died, the person died. Now, you've probably already seen it, but just to play, when you take out one particular part of the brain, you get exactly the same responses, except for here. This difficult situation where actually you were trying to cause harm, but no harm was done. And if you remove this part of the brain, or its activity, then you seem to have less of a sense that that is wrong. It becomes more acceptable. Now, these changes are not great. These are small differences, but they're real differences. And I raise this not to make a great big point, but really to introduce the possible technologies that you might use to take out this or that part of the brain temporarily and see what effect it has on morality. And in answer to the question, so what, there are a range of possible responses. One response would be, well, if you really interfere with the brain of someone, odd things are going to happen. That tells us nothing about the brain working in health. And I'm sympathetic to that view. But what if a member of your congregation has had a stroke in that part of the brain? What if a member of your congregation has a developmental disorder of this part of the brain? Doesn't that alter the flavour of how you might deal with them when you see the little it takes to induce a state of somewhat degenerate morality? Somewhat. Those are the sort of issues it raises. Okay, I'm nearly out of time. So, this is not meant to summarise the talk I've just given, but this is actually my kind of working diagram, working plot of which parts of the brain are involved in which parts of religious function. And the evidence for some of these comes from imaging, and I've shown you SPECT scan, that was that initial scan, very crude scan of the Buddhist meditator. I've shown you PET scans, which is where you have that injection in the artery, and mainly I've shown you functional magnetic resonance imaging scans where you're in the scanner like that, and you have the loud noise and the banging and all of that stuff. And a lot of the evidence for these statements comes from there, but also a lot of the evidence to support these associations comes from people with diseases. In my last few moments, what I wanted to say to you is that I think what has been underexplored today is the effect of having a brain disease like Alzheimer's, or temporal lobe epilepsy, or Parkinson's disease on spirituality. Now you, if you have a congregation, will be dealing with this several times a week, I should imagine. I go to a nursing home once a week and conduct a little service, and every time I go, this question arises. In people with brain diseases, to what extent is their spirituality a consequence of them, as it were, the integral them, or the disease affecting them? Does that matter? Is there a distinction? And how should we respond to that if we believe that the disease is interfering in some way with their religious spirituality? And we're hoping to do some research on this. So my conclusions about the brain and religious life, some of which I've explained and some of which I haven't today, the basis of them, is firstly that the brain is involved. And to some people that remains remarkable. And I don't think we should underestimate the degree, if you don't mind me putting it, of ignorance about how the brain works. And the assumption in many people that the brain just isn't involved in higher order cognition. I think religion is natural, is biological, is a manifestation of our bodies, not only our bodies, but I suspect higher mammals in some primitive way. That the different parts of the religious life, experience and belief are subserved, are mediated by different parts of the brain. And I haven't shown you this, but I think it's undoubtedly true that some of these are not expressed in life as fully as they could be because other parts of the brain deliberately suppress them. We can talk about that. The toolkit, these brain pathways, are poached from ordinary brain networks that are to do with how we interact with other human beings. There is no privatized God spot. This I won't go into, but here's the interesting speculation from one of those studies I've shown you, that actually when we say we don't believe something, we are disgusted by it. When we say we believe something to be true, we're attracted, and that gives us joy and pleasure. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. That's really fascinating, and I'm sure that will have provoked some questions. Yeah.
So, if you see some Christians not behaving kingdom of God wise, it may be because some part of the brain is at fault. Are you saying something like that?
Well, I'm not actually saying that, but I mean, that would be a hard materialist position to say that, and if I can just expand on that briefly, just to say that the key, the crux of the matter is what the neurons in your brain are doing. And that's where everything starts. The neurons have a certain pattern that's fixed. They activate pathways, those pathways generate perceptions, and we suddenly, in the end, we get them and we just do what we're told by our neurons. And we have no capacity to influence it. That is a bottom-up, hard reductionist position. And that would be the conclusion. that I behave like I am because my brain is like that, Minister. I can't help it. I've seen the scans on the Sunday Times. It shows me the brain is active. I have no control over that, Minister. And I think people say that. Now, the question comes, how much top-down processing is there? Are those 5-HT receptors that you saw a different one, are they the cause of different spiritual capacities, or are they the consequence of it? So just to give you a really trivial example, which I think is really helpful, is if you study the brains of London taxi drivers, okay, and you study them as they go through their learning of the knowledge and beyond, you will see that the more experience they have in driving a London taxi cab, the greater the volume of the part of the brain that deals with navigation. And to some extent, that's not a big surprise. But what it tells you is that our behaviour, our choice to become a London taxi cab driver, influences the structure of our brain. It wasn't that they started off with a brain that had particularly good navigation. They had normal brains. But their behaviour, their life choices, has increased that. If you deal pastorally with someone who's very involved in pornography, do you not accept that the more they have, the more they want? That this is an inflammatory thing, that their behaviour is modulating their brain chemistry so that they want more. Isn't that the partial experience of dealing with pornography? They just want more and more and more. So I think there is top-down processing as well. So to answer your question, and I'm sorry to take a long time over it, I think these two processes are happening together. So when in the limited experience I have of pastoral context, of dealing with people who've been banned, I would say that most people have a certain capacity for doing good or evil that is subscribed by biology. Just as I have a certain capacity for running the 100 metres, but I'm never going to run it as fast as Usain Bolt. I'm never going to do that. There are some people who are never going to be morally strong. They just can't. But, and here I think C.S. Lewis is helpful, but there is room for manoeuvre. And there is room to shift someone through the top-down process. So, I think people can have an appetite for pornography. It's very difficult to shift, but they can shift a bit. To give an example that's very close to me just at the moment. Does that help a bit?
A little bit in the sense that it sounds like you're saying that there's no fault in the brain
I think
that can't be overcome.
Well, I think there are some. I think our brains provide a fixed parameter, a fixed boundary, which we cannot go beyond. In the same way that my body does not allow me to run the 100 metres in 9.58 seconds. It never is going to, even if I train really, really hard. And I think our brains will subscribe our capacity for, well, I mean, to give you, I'm sure you would agree with this. Are there not people in your congregation who are more sensitive, more vulnerable, more appreciative of certain types of spiritual expression? And there are some who seem dull to that, who seem insensitive to that. Is that not a reflection of the fact that some have brains that are more attuned, more sympathetic to a certain type of spiritual expression? Would you accept that?
I accept.
And I think that's partly biologically determined, partly socially determined. But within that, there's scope to move. Yes.
Yes, heightening religious feeling through fasting extensively or flagellation or whatever, walking over hot coals, and there's a myriad of ways in which that can be done. What effect do you think that has on the brain?
I'm really glad you brought it up. I think in some ways dealing with the same thing, we can behave in such a way that we can alter our brain function. And a very simple, straightforward example, drastic example, the whirling dervishes. And my understanding of the whirling dervishes is that they essentially become so dehydrated, so in such a state of disequilibrium by activity that they faint and collapse. And they have a period of time when their brain just does not get perfused adequately. And so they get the same things that you get in near-death experiences. Sorry, the blood is not getting into their brain for a few seconds. And so they have the same thing that people have with near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, visions of bright lights and tunnels, which are due to parts of the brain getting diminished oxygen supply.
What about slain in the spirit and other manifestations?
Well, so I don't deny that there is authenticity to some of that. I don't deny that at all. But I have seen people, as it were, work themselves up into a physical frenzy and have that experience. Now, I think it's possible God might speak to them authentically through that, but I think the brain has been altered by the behaviour. The experience is induced by the physical behaviour. Just like taking drugs. Certain drugs will induce certain mystical experiences. And my personal position on that is that that's unlikely to be authentic. It's unlikely to be helpful. Good. Yes?
What about you still the sort of mind-brain debate, whether the mind is more than the brain or the brain is all there is?
Yeah, so we're going into reductionism, and I think this is a really burning topic. I think this is, in my little church environment, there are so many misunderstandings of this. So I think we need our brain to have a mind and a soul. And if we have no brain, we have no mind, and we have no soul. I don't think we can have a soul without a mind. So already I'm transgressing on some biblical passages and Platonic dualism. But the mind cannot be fully, or at least satisfactorily, explained by the brain. Just as the soul cannot be fully or satisfactorily explained by the mind. And if I can give a very trivial example that helps me to understand this, is that to say that table is wood is perfectly accurate. It is perfectly accurate to say that table is made of wood, and I could give you its chemical structure in 1 year. And that would be an explanation of that table. But it wouldn't be a full satisfactory explanation. To explain that table, you have to describe its form. You have to go up one level from the wood explanation. You'd say it has legs and things like that, in a flat surface. And that would be an explanation. But someone else might come along and say, my father made this. Now for them, that is a full and satisfactory explanation of that table. That cannot be reduced to that this table has a flat surface, which nonetheless is true. And it cannot be reduced to saying this table is made of wood. And yet one depends on the other. If you took the wood away, the father couldn't make it. So in my primitive understanding is that as you move up levels, you can get some faculties, some qualities that emerge that cannot be satisfactorily explained by a level. Is that helpful?
We might show the section on brain and mind and that on the test of faith tonight.
Yeah.
So that is helpful, certainly.
John, you had one again.
Yeah, well, I think as I sort of started to answer it, so I caught sight of one of your tables of the active constituent of magic mushrooms.
I'm really pleased about this, guy. I love talking about those.
And you just mentioned mind altering drugs in passing. Do you want to say anything more?
Yes. Yeah, I'm really pleased about that. So, I don't know if any of you have taken magic mushrooms, you don't have to say. But magic mushrooms are very interesting. So, the active constituent of magic mushroom is a chemical that acts on the 5-HT system, chemical pathway I showed you. And let me tell you about an experiment in which some university students were given either magic mushrooms or a drug that's Ritalin, that you will know is used in people, in young kids with, what's it called? So it's widely, but it's kind of amphetamine. And so the university students were given this, one of those drugs, and then 3 months later they were given another drug, the other one, as it were, it was crossed over. And lots of questions were asked. As you have the drug, how do you feel? And they had a range of experiences induced by these drugs, which are irrelevant for the point I'm going to make. 6 months later, the investigators came back and said to these students, how was that whole thing for you? Being part of that thing, how was it? And the majority of people who took the magic mushrooms said, this was amongst the 5 most important experiences in my life. It has changed my life. My life has new meaning. My life has new significance. Now, those same subjects were taken back to the university 10 years later, and this is a report just come out. So 10 years after this experiment, and this is a perfectly open experiment, they said, the investigators said, well, now it's so long ago, what was it all like? And still, the majority of people are saying this is amongst the top 5 most important things in my life. Since then, I've married my wife, I've had kids, and it's up there with it. Now, my interpretation of this is that the constituents of magic mushrooms are harnessing a brain mechanism that infers significance. Now, in this case, it was very artificial. It infers significance on something that didn't merit significance if it was artificial. But I think the reason I find this helpful is that when you talk to people about their spiritual lives, you will, or about anything, they will say, I went out last night, I saw the sunset, and God spoke to me. And you're thinking, well, I saw it. Didn't you know me? And I think the brain mechanism is that we saw the same thing, but the brain imposed significance on that event to you and it didn't on me. And I find it helpful because we can go through our spiritual lives and some things are highly significant for some others. Now, I don't say, to speak to you, sir, I don't say that it's the brain deciding what's significant. I think there's something else that's triggering that mechanism that the magic mushrooms are diverting, cutting in there too. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that there exists within people a mechanism for imposing significance that will enrich an experience that an other individual might just not have on that occasion. So the question might be, and here we can be really manipulative, potentially, is what if I gave magic mushrooms to everyone in my congregation on Sunday and I preached the word mightily? And for 10 years they're saying the most awesome experience for me was when they heard that. Do you see how you could potentially manipulate? And I think some of the things that are done in church environments or whatever might be doing that, might be manipulating, perhaps a pejorative word, might be harnessing some of these mechanisms.
John.
Can I make a comment and then ask you a question? Comment is in the history of ideas, how there has always been this trend to make human beings totally deterministic. So, whether it's astrology, whether it's the fates, there's economic determinism, which is sort of Marxism, there's psychological determinism, which is Freud, there's various other kinds of determinism, and the latest version of all this, well, the 2 latest versions are genetic determinism and neuroscience determinism. And it seems to me that what Orthodox Christianity has always said is, yes, these things influence us. Well, I'm not sure about astrology, but but no, we are not merely playthings. We are not ultimately the playthings of forces which are greater than us. And that part of our unique human dignity is that we have the dignity of choice. And I think it is interesting to see it in that perspective. This is merely the latest version of a very long-lasting argument. The question I would like to pose is that I see, from my perspective, some very threatening aspects of this, the rise of neuroscience, particularly in things like employment screening. You know, the theory being that we need to screen. So in future, you know, it's been suggested we'll screen future policemen, future doctors, to see, the theory being that we can actually look at people's prejudices and so on. Use in assessing moral decisions and whether a moral decision is valid by seeing which bits of the brain are lit. And in the law courts, I suppose, again, there's a sort of lie detector, and did you really do it or not? And do you have comments on the...
Well, I think I'm really pleased that this subject has emerged from this discussion, because I think it is absolutely key. And I gave a talk like this. I encountered a group of American kids, one of whom said he'd been taught that he could do anything he wanted if he tried hard enough. And so if he failed, it was because he hadn't tried hard enough. And actually I react very strongly against that from a positive deterministic position, which I was trying to put here, which is that I think there are boundaries that are determined by biology. And some people just can't run as fast as the same bolt. I mean, that, you know, we can't. So that's one aspect of it. And so, when a few years ago, a prominent member of the university here, who was a dean of a chapel, wandered out onto Parker's Piece and took his trousers down and exhibited himself to a student and went to the police. And it was discovered he was having an epileptic seizure. I think we have to allow for the possibility that our brains can determine behaviour, which then becomes amoral. And he got on, and I thought that was right. So I think we have to recognise the truth that we are limited, we are constrained, but that there's room for manoeuvre, and that room for manoeuvre is different for different people, is how I see it. And I think our theology should allow people to be released from their constraints, or at least diverted from them, but recognise that they're there. So I'm frightened by both things. I'm frightened by the position that says you are nothing but your neurons, and I'm frightened by the position that says you can do anything you want to if you try hard enough.
It's interesting that possibly any of us could become London taxi drivers. We might think we could, yes, but maybe not everyone can become a brain scientist or a brilliant mathematician.
Well, I don't think. I mean, have you not met people who cannot drive? I know people who cannot drive. They just can't. I mean, have you not met people like that? I think there are people who just lack visuospatial ability and cannot drive.
It's got implications as well for people who are brain damaged. Maybe not by accident, but people who haven't been nurtured or cared for, or who have been stunted in some way.
Absolutely. And you see, this is where it comes down to, you know, the tyre rubber hits the road, whatever that expression is for me, because this is what I do on a daily basis, deal with people with brain diseases. And, you know, I don't think they can overcome the limitations of their disease. I've not seen that happen. I think those should be recognised. And so the question is, what scope is there for a religious life in someone who's had the whole of one hemisphere of the brain destroyed by a process? What does it mean that they might have spiritual life? That's not the same as saying that we should treat people with dignity. Those are different things.
for a time, I taught children who had behavioural difficulties and were severely damaged. And sometimes you would see one of these people put more effort into 5 minutes good behaviour than I would put into a whole week. And I think that's got questions for God and our relationship with God and forgiveness and the whole business of life.
I think personally, I think I think individual morality is relative. It's relative from your past. I don't think it's an absolute. That's to be
Dave.
Was Balaam's donkey undergoing a genuine religious experience?
Undoubtedly. So, I mean, animals and religion. So, well, okay. I haven't got anything further to say on it.
Just, I've heard people with a theory that lie detectors work, in that even the most ardent criminal know, as far as they're concerned, human remorse about what they've done. The lie detector picks up on that because potentially the spiritual struggle that's going on deep inside that affects chemicals and stuff within the body, that happens because they were designed by God to do right. And therefore the lie detector works because it picks up on the spiritual struggle inside, even though they don't necessarily realise it. I wonder if you have any comment on that.
I'm really sorry, I just can't contribute to that because I know nothing about meditation. I'm really sorry. Certainly in terms of brain maps, sociopaths do not have the same activation pattern when they see images of people who are tortured or whatever. They show no brain mechanisms that would be recognisably those of empathy. But that doesn't quite contradict what you're saying.
Interesting. John again?
Just on religious experience, I think we should try to avoid the over-intellectualising or over-cognitivizing what we think of as religious experience. I mean, it's obviously true that for most of us nice middle-class educated people, that cognitive processing is a significant part of our religious lives. But I suspect that many people with profound brain dysfunction, including such things as dementing illnesses and other kinds of brain dysfunction, have a profound capacity for some kind of religious awareness which isn't expressed cognitively. And just a little anecdote, a friend of mine father had severe Alzheimer's, had got to the stage where he was virtually mute, and she was watching with him Songs of Praise, which was on the television, and out on an impulse she said to him, "Do you ever still pray, Dad?" And to her amazement, her father, who'd been virtually mute, said yes. And she said to him, "What do you say to God when you pray?" And there was this terribly long pause, and he said, "I say hello." And that was it. But I thought that was actually rather profound, really, that how do you know what is going on there, and that the fact that it can't be expressed in a sort of rational, cognitive form doesn't mean it isn't real.
I completely agree. There's a form of epilepsy which I've referred to, which can induce religious spiritual experiences, and it can affect children. And children can bring it on by flashing lights, which is difficult for them to do, or taking a standard light and doing this. And babies as young as 3 or 4 have been seen to induce seizures because they're pleasurable, because there's something that's good about them. And then they go on later on in life, and they'll gradually acquire words which explain what the experience is. But this is at a stage where they can't conceive it; they just know it to be good or pleasurable, and they induce it. So I couldn't agree with you more. Of course, the difficulty is studying precognitive emotions, experience is very difficult. Did you have one?
Well, it's a completely different sort of question. I mean, I look at these pictures and I have absolutely no knowledge of any of this. But I gather that there are quite a lot of neurons in the brain. And there are these big fuzzy areas, which I assume must be, what, millions, billions, I don't know, of neurons doing things. And it seems to me, sort of, how can one attach very much significance at any kind of detail level?
I think it's a very perceptive comment. The resolution of these scans is hopeless. We're not even looking at individual tracks, and certainly not at individual neurons. So you have more neurons in you than stars in the Milky Way. And if you allow that any neuron can have up to 10,000 connections with other neurons, then we're talking about 10 to the 17 individual computer nodes, which is more than there are stars. So our brains are truly more complicated than the universe in terms of individual nodes. It's astonishing. So I think you're absolutely right. So if you come away from here thinking that you're not that impressed, then I would completely share that view.
Now there's another question. Is there a question near the back? Yeah.
You were talking about the brain being affected by different things, spiritual or other things in life. The media comments on charismatic Christians and hellfire preachers, but would you not have the same effect in the brain from a football match or from a violent video?
Well, that's a fantastic question. Absolutely fantastic question. So in many ways I agree with you. And just to make the point in relation, if you remember I showed you the Catholics and the Blessed Virgin Mary. The control for that was wrong. It shouldn't be atheists with a neutral picture. It should be me with Theo Walcott, who plays for Arsenal in England, because I really care about him. I really do. You know, I want him to play all season. I'm emotionally involved in that person. So actually that experiment was badly designed. So it didn't really test faith or anything. It tested the impact on pain of seeing someone you care about and are involved in. So I think many of the feelings which we call religious can be induced in football crowds. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Or in other contexts, I agree. And some of the data I've shown you really speaks to that, because it says this God stuff, this God experience, is just like human interactions. It's not different, or it's the brain doesn't process it differently.
Good. Maybe we've got time for one last one at this stage. Anyone want to? Yeah.
The last one, as long as those got a more important one. I'm just going to ask, I was reading a report, I think, that saying that all these brain training things don't really work, but they just they teach you to play the game, but they don't actually improve your memory in the general sense. So I just want to have a comment on that.
Yeah, well that's...
Can you give me hope?
Well, give you hope that because you've never done one of these. No, that's
sure about improve my memory.
No, so that's right. So that's research done here by Adrian Owen, and it was fantastic research because it was done on the web. It had, I forget how many thousands of participants, but it basically tested people before they bought one of these machines and then after, and showed that you improve your ability at the very task you've trained in, but that doesn't spill over to improve your ability in other tasks. So only buy one of those machines if you want to be very good at one of those machines.
Does that apply to the kind of taxi driver thing then? It's one particular task.
That's absolutely right. So taxi drivers become very, very good at spatial navigation, and they're good at navigating around their home, and so on, and they can navigate in their head, but it doesn't spill over into any other task. That's different from the research, and I think this is important as well with saying this, is that it is definitely true that an enriched environment through childhood and adulthood prevents or reduces the impact of dementia later on. So your high level of education, high level of emotional enrichment in childhood is protected against the effects of dementia, which isn't the same thing.
Good. Well, I think we'll stop at this point. Now, there is the box for questions for Alasdair as well, so think about that. Let's give him a round of applause.